And finally, number 5, Christmas gifts. It's the most wonderful time of the year until you look at the price tag for presents. According to one report, shoppers will be paying more than $100 more to buy the same gifts as last year. Meanwhile, trees, decorations, candy, and booze have gotten more expensive, and small businesses, far from raking in holiday sales, are losing revenue and being forced to lay off workers. A good friend of mine used to say, people vote for you for their reasons, not yours. And you know, people vote against you for their reasons and not yours. And the reason the Democrats lost the election last year is because everything was up. Is because the prices went through the roof on everything.
Listen to what you just heard, because this is going to be the first of many bombs I'm dropping tonight. And you need to understand that what we just witnessed is the precise moment when American political discourse stopped pretending that economic pain is some kind of abstract policy disagreement and started admitting the horrifying truth that Trump is ruining the economy on purpose, something perhaps unprecedented for a chief executive of any country. Senator Brian Schatz just said the quiet part out loud, and I need you to feel the weight of that accusation, because we're not talking about incompetence anymore. We're not talking about policy differences. We're talking about deliberate sabotage, and you need to grasp the sheer audacity and moral clarity it takes for a sitting United States senator to stand on the floor of the most powerful legislative body in the world and declare that the president is intentionally making you poorer while you struggle to buy Christmas gifts for your children, and the evidence for this claim is so overwhelming that it should make your blood boil with righteous fury. Here's the part that should wake you up in cold sweats because of the voters who rated the economy negatively in 2024. 69% voted for Trump, and they did so because they believed he would be their economic savior. They believed the con that the man who inherited hundreds of millions from his father and filed for bankruptcy multiple times understood their pain better than the Democrats who actually delivered 2.8% annualized growth in the fourth quarter of 2024. But here's what's happening right now in December 2025, and this is where the betrayal becomes so visceral you can taste it. Trump's tariff policies are undoubtedly making life more expensive for Americans, despite the administration's claims that other countries would pay $5 and the more can for noted. December is usually a bright spot for households, but the administration's unprecedented tariffs are driving up prices on consumer goods and cutting into what families can afford, with Trump's tariffs adding to inflation and holding back families this holiday season. Think about that for a moment, because the exact people who voted for this man because groceries were too expensive are now paying even more for groceries, for toys, for everything their families need, and the cruelty is the point, because this isn't happening by accident. Wait until you hear what the actual data reveals, and this is going to make you want to throw something across the room, because the Trump tariffs amount to an average tax increase of $1,000 per U.S. household in 2025. Let me repeat that so it sinks into your consciousness. $1,200 per household as a direct tax on working families. And that's not even the worst part, because Trump's wide-ranging tariffs will cost businesses in the U.S. an additional $1.2 trillion this year, with consumers shouldering most of those costs, as companies have passed on roughly 2/3 of those tariff costs, $592 billion to consumers in the form of higher prices. This is economic violence dressed up in the language of America First nationalism, and the people being hurt the most are exactly the ones who thought Trump would rescue them from economic anxiety. But here's the bombshell that connects everything. According to exit poll data, Kamala Harris won among families who made less than $30,000 in 2023, and those who made more than $100,000, while Trump won among families who earned between $30,000 and $99,999. Too much to qualify for government assistance, but in many cases not enough to get by. Do you see what happened there? The working class and lower middle class, the people who are genuinely struggling, handed power to a man who is now systematically extracting wealth from their pockets and transferring it upward through policy choices that any first-year economics student could tell you would increase prices. Now let me take you deeper into this, because the liberal commentariat wants you to believe this is just incompetence or that Trump doesn't understand economics, but Senator Schatz is telling you something far more disturbing, and you need to hear this. He is ruining the economy on purpose, and there's never been an American president who has ruined the economy on purpose. Think about what that means in terms of political theory, because we're conditioned by decades of neoliberal consensus to believe that everyone in power at least wants economic growth, even if they disagree on methods. But what happens when you have a president whose material interests and those of his oligarchic cabinet are actually served by economic chaos? by asset deflation, by working families losing their savings and their purchasing power. The stock market had its worst day in 5 years, and if you spent all your life working and saving and investing, and are on the edge of retirement with, say, $312,000 plus Social Security income, you just lost 30 grand in 2 days because of Donald Trump, losing 10% of what you earned over a lifetime. This is wealth destruction on a massive scale, and who benefits from that? The ultra-wealthy who can buy assets at rock-bottom prices, who can weather any storm because they have infinite capital reserves, who can use economic crisis as an opportunity for consolidation and accumulation while everyone else drowns. But here's where it gets even more sinister, and this connects to a longer historical pattern of conservative economic policy that you absolutely must understand because Trump's changed his mind about just about everything, but not on tariffs. He's a self-proclaimed tariff man, who's repeatedly said that tariff is the most beautiful word in the English language, and for years he's lavished praise on the 20th century tariffs which helped to deepen the Great Depression. Read that again, because Trump is openly admiring economic policies that caused the worst economic catastrophe in American history and implementing them with enthusiasm, and this isn't some gotcha moment from his opponents. These are his own words, his own stated preferences, his own ideological commitments, and when someone tells you who they are, you should believe them the first time. The man is telling you he wants to recreate economic conditions from an era when bread lines stretched around city blocks and when economic desperation paved the way for fascist movements across the globe. And you might think I'm being hyperbolic, but then you look at their actual theory that the Golden Age was from 1870 to 1913, as the president himself said, and Commerce Secretary Lutnick said a recession would be worth it, because in the Gilded Age some people were very wealthy. Robber barons and business tycoons built enormous empires on the backs of working people who had little to show for it. Profits boomed, billionaires emerged, regular people suffered in tenements and on factory floors with poverty everywhere. And the Gilded Age is exactly what the president is trying to recreate. Let that marinate for a second, because we're not dealing with dog whistles or subtext anymore. They're openly saying they want to return to an era of maximum inequality and labor exploitation, an era before the New Deal, before Social Security, before the 8-hour workday, before any of the protections that working people fought and died for, and belief in President Donald Trump's ability to manage the economy and reduce inflation was a leading reason for his narrow election win in 2024, which makes the betrayal all the more grotesque, because the people who trusted him to fix the economy are now the primary victims of his deliberate economic sabotage. Donald Trump has made shortages the cornerstone of his economic agenda, and it is working, with shortages of nearly everything including food, electricity, healthcare workers, and with less supply to go around everything costs more. This is not a bug, this is the feature. Because if you create artificial scarcity, you can control prices and consolidate power and make working people so desperate they'll accept any conditions just to survive, which is exactly how capitalism functioned in the Gilded Age before labor organizing and progressive politics forced concessions from capital. Now here's the data that shows how this is playing out in real time, and you need to understand these numbers because they represent actual human suffering. Data from the HBS Pricing Lab show noticeable price increases for toys, personal care products, and small appliances such as air fryers and coffee machines, with several product categories showing especially steep price increases, including clothing accessories, jewelry, and household tools. These aren't luxury goods for the wealthy. These are the basic consumer products that working families need for daily life, the Christmas gifts mentioned in that clip, the tools people need for their homes and their work, and product categories. Seeing some of the biggest price hikes due to tariffs include furniture, car parts, electronics, and musical instruments. Think about a parent trying to buy their kid a musical instrument for school, or a family trying to replace a broken appliance, or someone who needs car parts to keep their vehicle running so they can get to work. These are not abstract economic indicators. These are the material conditions of people's lives being made measurably worse by policy choices that serve the interests of billionaires and oligarchs. And speaking of billionaires, let me give you another explosion of rage-inducing information, because while working families are seeing analysts from the Yale Budget Lab expect an average per-household cost of $2,400 due to tariffs in 2025, Trump and congressional Republicans are pushing through plans to make deep cuts to Medicaid and food assistance programs to fund tax giveaways for wealthy households. Do you understand the full picture now? They're taking money from programs that help poor people afford food and healthcare and giving it to billionaires in tax cuts, while simultaneously imposing what amounts to a massive regressive sales tax through tariffs that hits the working class hardest. And this is happening during the Christmas season, when families are already stretched thin, trying to provide basic dignity and joy for their children, trying to participate in the cultural rituals that define American life, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy in an increasingly dystopian economic landscape. The price of eggs has gone up by 15%, which is the single biggest monthly increase in 10 years, and the price of coffee is up 25% since the start of the year, with everything from gas to housing to car insurance getting more expensive. But here's what should really keep you up at night, because this gets to the intentionality question that Senator Schatz is raising. There should be no mistaking this is what Trump intends to do, and this is one of the differences between Trump 1.0 and Trump 2.0. He's doing all the things. He's actually going through with it. This is not mean tweets. This is all of the crazy stuff he's saying being effectuated as public policy, as economic policy, as fiscal policy. The first Trump administration was chaotic and destructive, but there were guardrails. There were people in the room saying no. There were policy proposals that never materialized. But now in his second term, he's surrounded himself with ideologues and oligarchs who share his vision of economic destruction and reconstruction along authoritarian lines. People like Howard Lutnick and Elon Musk and everybody that surrounds him at Mar-a-Lago who can ride this out while everyone else suffers. Think about what Elon Musk has to gain from economic chaos, because if the stock market crashes and asset prices plummet, he can buy up even more of the economy at bargain prices. He can consolidate his already obscene levels of wealth and power. He can position himself to control even more of the infrastructure that determines how we live and work and communicate. And let's talk about the political economy of this moment, because a whopping 73% of voters said they were angry or dissatisfied with the way things were going in 2024, with 68% of voters describing the economy as not so good or poor, and Trump won those voters 70% to 28%. This is the tragic irony at the heart of American politics right now, because the anger is real, the economic pain is real, the sense that the system is rigged is absolutely real, but that anger got channeled toward a con man who promised to burn it all down, and who is now quite literally doing that, but in a way that hurts the very people who elevated him to power. The Democrats failed to speak to that anger effectively, failed to provide a compelling counter-narrative, failed to make people understand that the inflation they were experiencing was a global phenomenon driven by pandemic supply chain disruptions and corporate profiteering, not the result of democratic policy, and virtually all rich nations were hit with far higher inflation amid a COVID-induced shift in consumption patterns and Russia's war in Ukraine, which disrupted global supply chains, though nonpartisan economic studies found that Biden's $1.9 trillion rescue plan in 2021 exacerbated inflation perhaps by 3 percentage points, but also powered the economy's growth. But Trump doesn't care about global supply chains or economic complexity because his politics are rooted in grievance and scapegoating and the big lie that all problems can be solved through strongman authority, and that foreigners are stealing from us and that tariffs will magically bring back manufacturing jobs, when the reality is factory employment has dropped by more than 40,000 jobs since April, while the ISM index of manufacturing activity fell in October for the 8th month in a row. The jobs aren't coming back. The prices are going up. The economy is being deliberately destabilized, and who wins in that scenario? Not the working families who are seeing their purchasing power evaporate, not the small businesses that are getting crushed by uncertainty and rising costs, but the oligarchs who can profit from chaos, and who can use crisis to restructure the economy even more in their favor. This is shock doctrine capitalism playing out in real time, and J.P. Morgan Global Research expects the business sector to be poised for a large sentiment shock, which could be one of the factors spurring the economy towards a recession, with the uncertainty associated with tariff increases and the general thrust of Trump administration policies now depressing business sentiment, which will directly weigh on spending and hiring. 61% of Americans said Trump's policies have worsened economic conditions in this country, according to a CNN SSRS poll, and he's underwater with the public on his handling of the economy, with a 57% disapproval rating. The people who can weather this storm are the ones who don't need to worry about the price of eggs or Christmas gifts or car repairs. Unless you are a billionaire getting enormous tax cuts and generous corporate giveaways, this economy sucks, with costs piling up and saving money nearly impossible, and just getting by, let alone buying a home or raising a family, a lot harder. This is naked class warfare disguised as economic policy, and the Democrats' failure in the 2024 election was not recognizing that you can't fight class warfare with technocratic policy papers and means-tested tax credits. You have to name the enemy, you have to identify the villains, you have to channel popular rage toward the people who actually deserve it, which is the billionaire class that's looting the country while working people suffer. And here's another bombshell that reveals the scope of the grift, because between April and July 2025, American businesses that import have already paid an additional $67.3 billion to 40,000 small businesses. This results in an average of more than $90,000 per business. Small businesses, the supposed backbone of American capitalism, the entrepreneurial class that Republicans claim to champion, are being systematically destroyed by Trump's policies because they don't have the capital reserves to absorb these costs. They can't engage in the kind of tax avoidance schemes that multinational corporations use. They can't lobby for exemptions. They just get crushed between rising input costs and customers who can't afford higher prices. And all of this is happening while Trump grades himself A+++++ on the economy and calls affordability concerns a Democratic hoax and claims the economy has entered a golden age, which would be laughable if it weren't so tragic, because this disconnect between Trump's rhetoric and people's lived reality is gaslighting on a national scale. But let's zoom out to the bigger picture, because this isn't just about tariffs or inflation or even deliberately sabotaging the economy. This is about a broader authoritarian project that uses economic destabilization as one tool among many to consolidate power. Donald Trump is trashing the economy and creating shortages of everything, including electricity, food, workers, and healthcare, single-handedly ruining people's personal finances and the American economy on purpose, and his illegal actions and brazen takeovers of the media and private sector institutions and American cities are the stuff of authoritarians throughout history and across the planet. This is the synthesis that liberals often miss, because they want to treat each Trump outrage as a separate scandal, when in fact they're all part of the same coherent project of demolishing democratic institutions and norms and replacing them with oligarchic control. And economic chaos serves that project perfectly, because desperate people are easier to control, because crisis conditions justify emergency measures, because when people are struggling to survive, they have less bandwidth for political engagement and collective organizing. Now let me bring this back to the clip we started with, because that senator talking about Democrats losing the election because prices went through the roof, that analysis is correct but incomplete, because the full story is that voters were right to be angry about economic conditions, but tragically wrong about who would fix them. And the reason they were wrong is because we've had 40 years of neoliberal propaganda telling us that government is the problem and markets are the solution, and that billionaire businessmen know how to run things better than career politicians, and that ideological framework made it possible for a transparently corrupt and incompetent con man to position himself as an economic populist, even though everything about his actual record and policy preferences serves the interests of capital against labor. Republican nostalgia for the economy under Trump's first term is largely misguided, though the GOP's pessimism over current economic conditions resonated with voters because people aren't actually good at distinguishing between correlation and causation. They remember that gas was cheaper in 2019 without understanding that was because of a global pandemic that temporarily crashed demand. They remember better times without recognizing all the ways those times were already unsustainable and built on growing inequality and financialization. And here's what makes me want to scream into the void, because the U.S. economy remains very strong, the envy of the developed world with inflation tamed, growth robust, and the best labor market in 50 years, but voters have consistently reported economic dissatisfaction in surveys all year. This is the perverse achievement of right-wing media and propaganda, that they've managed to convince people the economy is terrible, even when by traditional metrics it's doing well. And yes, there are real affordability issues, especially for housing and healthcare, that GDP growth doesn't capture. And yes, there's wage stagnation and precarity, and all the ways that aggregate statistics don't reflect the lived experience of working people. But the point is that Trump inherited a strong economy, and through deliberate policy choices is making it worse, is creating the very conditions of scarcity and inflation that he campaigned against. And he's doing this because this is a deliberate economic program. He has a coherent economic theory, which is we should shrink the supply of everything, because he thinks it strengthens the dollar. Let me pause here, because that last point is crucial to understanding the intentionality question, because Trump isn't just bumbling around making random bad decisions. He has an ideological framework, even if it's economically illiterate. He believes that making things scarce makes America stronger. He believes in a zero-sum mercantilist worldview, where trade is warfare, and where causing pain to trading partners is inherently good, even if it also hurts Americans. And this ideology maps perfectly onto authoritarian politics, because authoritarianism thrives on scarcity and competition for resources, rather than abundance and cooperation. When there's not enough to go around, people fight over the scraps instead of organizing to demand a bigger pie. And that's exactly what Trump and his oligarchic backers want, because a fractured and desperate working class is much easier to dominate than a confident and organized one that's making collective demands for a fair share of the wealth it creates. And you know what's truly breathtaking in its cynicism? The idea that other countries will just graciously pay the tariffs is a fantasy, much like Trump's claim that Mexico would pay for the wall, when in reality it's American importers who pay the tariffs and then pass it on to consumers, which is exactly what happened the last time Trump tried this. As economists who studied the tariffs Trump imposed during his first term on certain goods from China found that it was consumers who paid the price. Everyone who knows anything about economics has explained this over and over. It's Econ 101. Tariffs are taxes paid by importers, not exporters. They get passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices. This is not disputed by anyone with any credibility, and yet Trump continues to lie about it, and his supporters continue to believe the lie because facts don't matter anymore in our post-truth hellscape. What matters is the narrative, the story that feels true even when it's empirically false, the story that foreigners are taking advantage of us, and Trump is the strong daddy who will punish them even if that punishment mostly falls on American families. So let's be absolutely clear about what's happening right now in December 2025, as families struggle to afford Christmas presents and basic necessities, because it's now abundantly clear that Trump is not making anything cheaper. In fact, he's purposefully making everything more expensive, including healthcare, groceries, toys, cars, housing, electricity, computers, clothes, booze, and video games, with prices continuing to go up, whether shopping at local grocery stores or Walmart. This is comprehensive economic degradation, touching every aspect of daily life, and it's being done deliberately by people who are insulated from its consequences, by people who see working-class suffering as an acceptable price for their ideological project, or even as a desirable outcome that makes workers more desperate and compliant. The worst part is there was actually no reason for any of this. There's no pandemic. We're not in the middle of a war. There's no ongoing emergency. This is a crisis of the president's own making, and we're all paying the price. And that brings me back to Senator Schatz's central claim that Trump is ruining the economy on purpose. And you need to understand, this isn't partisan hyperbole. This is a serious charge backed by serious evidence, because when you look at the totality of Trump's economic policies, they don't make sense if the goal is broadly shared prosperity, but they make perfect sense if the goal is upward wealth transfer and authoritarian consolidation of power. The Budget Lab at Yale projects that Trump's tariffs announced to date will increase U.S. prices by 2.3% in the near term, the equivalent to an average consumer loss of $3,800 per household, with households near the bottom of the income distribution seeing a decrease in disposable income that is 2.5 times larger than that experienced by those in the top decile. This is textbook regressive taxation, taking disproportionately from the poor to benefit the rich, and it's being implemented alongside tax and spending proposals that would increase primary deficits by $5.8 trillion over the next 10 years on a conventional basis, which will be used to justify cuts to Social Security and Medicare and all the programs that working people depend on. The full picture is diabolical in its elegance, because Trump creates economic chaos through tariffs and deportations and deregulation. That chaos hurts working people and small businesses while benefiting large corporations and the wealthy who can capitalize on crisis. The resulting deficits from tax cuts for the rich are then used to justify austerity for everyone else. And through it all, Trump maintains his base support by blaming immigrants and Democrats and China and anyone except the people actually responsible, which is himself and his oligarchic backers. It's a closed loop of manufactured crisis and authoritarian response that keeps getting worse because there's no limiting principle, no moment where Trump says, okay, we've gone too far, because going too far is the point, because the goal is not good governance but the demonstration of power and the punishment of enemies real and imagined. 61% of Americans said Trump's policies have worsened economic conditions in this country, according to a CNN poll, higher than the 58% peak under Biden when it was generally in the low to mid-50s, and 59% of Americans blamed Trump at least a good amount for the current inflation rate, according to a Washington Post ABC News poll, while Biden's numbers on this question were actually lower at 48% in November 2021 and 50% in February 2022, even when inflation was spiking. So Trump is actually doing worse on public perception of economic management than Biden did during the worst of the inflation crisis. And yet Trump won the election on economic issues, which tells you everything about how narratives and vibes matter more than facts. about how the right has successfully built a media ecosystem that can shape reality independent of material conditions, about how Democrats failed to effectively communicate economic information or provide a compelling alternative vision. But the resistance to Trump's economic destruction is building because the high and rising prices of healthcare, groceries, and housing are a leading impediment to the lives of millions of Americans who can't wait, nor can Republican lawmakers who fear the president's response will doom their re-election chances next year, with Pennsylvania Rep. Brian Fitzpatrick, one of the most at-risk Republicans, saying every bill should be focused on lowering the cost of living for people who need it most. The political pressure is mounting. Even some Republicans are getting nervous because they understand that voters will punish economic failure, regardless of partisan loyalty, and this creates an opening for a renewed progressive movement that can channel popular rage toward productive ends, that can connect economic anxiety to its actual causes in oligarchic capitalism and authoritarian politics, that can build power from below to force concessions from above. So what do we do with this information? How do we respond to the reality that the President of the United States is deliberately impoverishing working families during the Christmas season? First, we name it clearly without euphemism or false balance, because Senator Schatz is right. Trump is ruining the economy on purpose, and that needs to be said plainly and repeatedly until it penetrates public consciousness. Second, we connect individual suffering to systemic causes, because someone struggling to buy Christmas gifts needs to understand that's not their personal failure, but the result of deliberate policy choices by people who don't care if they suffer. Third, we build alternative institutions and networks of mutual aid and solidarity, because we can't wait for electoral salvation when people need help right now, surviving Trump's economic assault. Fourth, we organize politically to contest every election at every level, because the only way to stop this is to remove Republicans from power and replace them with people committed to working-class interests. And fifth, we don't just resist Trump, but articulate a bold, positive vision of what's possible when the economy serves human needs instead of capital accumulation, when we have universal healthcare and housing and education as rights, not commodities, when workers control the wealth they create instead of watching it flow upward to billionaires and oligarchs. Because here's what I need you to understand as we close. This isn't just about Trump, he's a symptom, not the disease. The disease is late-stage capitalism eating itself. The disease is 40 years of neoliberalism that destroyed worker power and deregulated finance and privatized public goods. The disease is a political system captured by oligarchs and serving their interests against the vast majority. And Trump is what that system produces when it stops bothering to maintain even the pretense of democratic legitimacy or broadly shared prosperity. Trump is single-handedly ruining people's personal finances and the American economy on purpose because he believes in shortages. He wants there to be not enough workers, not enough healthcare, not enough electrons, not enough food, and that vision of artificial scarcity in the midst of potential abundance is the essence of authoritarian capitalism, using deliberate privation to control populations and justify oligarchic rule. So yes, Trump is making you poor on purpose. Christmas is more expensive because of deliberate policy choices. Working families are suffering while billionaires prosper, and this is all exactly what they intended. But we don't have to accept it. We don't have to lie down and take it. We can organize and resist and build something better from the ruins of neoliberal capitalism and Trumpist authoritarianism, but only if we're willing to see clearly what we're up against and fight accordingly with the urgency and moral clarity that this moment demands.